everyone, and welcome. My name is Kedra Daniels Navaroli. I'm a board member for the Surface Design Association and art history faculty at the University of Central Florida, and your moderator for today. And I was just telling our presenter that I apologize that for the last hour I've been on the phone with my university's IT department. So apologies in advance for any brain cells that I may skip over during this talk, but I am very excited to be here today. And I'm pleased to welcome you all. And if you haven't already, please drop who you are and where you're from in the chat. But I'm happy to welcome you all to this week's Textile Talk, Quilts That Speak, What History Has Buried, with Phyllis Biffle-Elmore. Textile Talk webinars are weekly Zoom webinars brought to you by four partnering organizations: the International Quilt Museum, Quilt Alliance, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association, or SDA as it is commonly known. SDA has been an international leader in fiber arts for nearly 50 years. Our diverse community includes studio artists, designers, educators, curators, gallery owners, students, and writers with a shared passion for fiber art. Being a member of SDA offers opportunities to exhibit your work, access new skills, grow your artist network, and learn from a broad range of artists working from around the world. Every member has access to our quarterly publication, bringing the world of contemporary fiber arts to your fingertips. We welcome you to our community. Please visit our website to start your membership. First-time members can use the code TALKS in all cap, TALKS, for 10% off their membership. So before we start, I just want to note a few housekeeping announcements. We welcome questions. What we're going to do is Phyllis is going to give her presentation, and we will answer those questions at the end of her talk. Please submit them. There's a Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we ask that you enter your questions there so that I can be sure to relay them to Phyllis during our Q&A. So we are honored to bring you free and inspiring Textile Talks programming, and we respectfully ask that you be courteous as you engage with speakers, moderators, and other participants. Your chat comments can be seen by everyone. Please use the Q&A for questions, chat box for greeting others, and a survey at the end of the presentation for ways that we can improve or topics that you may be interested in and exploring in the future. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for Phyllis's presentation. Let's see here. Let me make sure that I can actually do that. Okay, and Ms. Phyllis, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So a really quick introduction. As I said, I am thrilled to introduce Phyllis Biffle-Elmore, author of Quilt of Souls, a memoir. Phyllis was born in Detroit, Michigan, and at the age of 4, she was sent to the tiny town of Livingston, Alabama, to be raised by her grandmother and quilter Lula Young Horn, who was born in 1883 and passed in 1988, so a very long life. Grandmother Lula's quilts were special because she made them exclusively from the clothing of deceased family members, friends, and neighbors. These quilts rest at the heart of storytelling and communal heritage in the regional South. Each strip of fabric in Grandmother Lula's quilts told the story of the wearer's life and death, and she often shared those mostly tragic, sometimes witty tales of these individuals with little Phyllis as she sewed. In Phyllis's memoir, each chapter tells the stories of the people whose clothings make up her own Quilt of Souls. Her work challenges us to remember the history of quilting and the power and lives held within these objects. Each piece of cloth weaved together broken lives, and Phyllis now shares these profound stories with the world as Grandmother Lula told them to her. Thank you, Phyllis, for being with us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Matter of fact, let me change that to honored to be here. Yes, like Kedra said, I truly believe that quilts speak history, uncovered history. I grew up in that environment, as Kedra has given you a little short bio of my life growing up in Alabama. But let me preface everything by saying I'm a quilt documentician. That's Phyllis's word. That's not a Webster word. I'm also a storyteller. I'm an author. And in saying that, my stories are weaved into my writing. So therefore, when I speak about quilting, I say my pen is my needle, my ink is my thread. So that's my little short life of my quilting experience. I tell this story because the tales that older women, my grandmother's age, and her mentors and her people in her same age range as I was growing up down in the country, and I'm going to use the word country, but that's when I say that, I mean rural, very rural Livingston, Alabama. The tales that these women told to me, they are sacred and they should be saved for posterity. A lot of times we have forgotten about the passing down of oral history and how important those things are. So I was a I consider myself a child of the Great Black Migration of the 1950s and 60s. I was born in 1953. So, as you know, a lot of blacks were sent south. A lot of blacks left the South and went north in the 40s and 50s and better in for better opportunities, economical, social. But when they got north, they ran into financial difficulties. So a lot of times a child or two was sent back south to live with their grandparents, their parents, my grandparents. Um, I was one of those children, and I wasn't alone because a lot of children in that same rural area was also being raised by their grandparents. I was 4 years old. I was scared. I'd never seen these grandparents before in my life, but I met my grandmother for the first time, and she was a master quilter. Her quilts were very healing for me. Even at the age of 4, I would sit and listen to her talk about her quilts. Now, my grandmother I would say, over my 12 years living with my grandmother, she changed me cellularly. And also she fundamentally grounded me. As I reached into adulthood, these are the stories that she told that turned into shaping my life and was the impetus of me writing Quilt of Souls, a memoir. My grandmother, and as I'm talking about my grandmother, I want you, if you just indulge me and just keep that image of her and some of the things I'm going to show you in your mind, because I'm going to go back to that. My grandmother was born in Sandersonville, Mississippi in 1883. She had 4 older siblings who were sold in slavery. Her parents were born in the 1840s. Her sister came along in 1877 named Ella. Ella passed away at the age of 19 and she was killed by the ex-slave owner. As a result, her mother and her father died from the tragedy, and the father absconded and was never heard from again. This quilt, next slide. I'm sorry. I want to give you a vision of the area that I grew up in. I go back down south or down in the country at least once a year because I want to take in that scenery. I want to smell that area where these women used to sit outside and quilt. My grandmother used to sit up under the old oak tree and quilt. Other women from her era used to join her and come and quilt, and they used to tell stories. So I go back south, and it's still rural. The house is gone, but I can sense, I love getting that feeling of being in that environment because this is an environment that I will never forget. And this is the road, which I will go back to that led to my great aunt's house. And they were also quilters. And as you can see on the right-hand side, that was a very rural area too, because it was about a mile down the road, but they have their own place in my presentation as well. Next slide. Next slide, please. This is my quilt. Oh, you go back one. Okay, I'm sorry. This is my Quilt of Souls. Now, my grandmother placed her placement of clothing in the quilt, and as Kedra had said before, my grandmother only made quilts of the clothing for people who passed on. if you try to give her a new piece of cloth, that wasn't a great feel because she would get angry. So she only made clothing. She only made her quilts from the clothing of people who had passed on. People would bring bags of clothing, and my grandma, it was almost like a ritual. She would take the clothing and she would pray over them, and then she put them in the smokehouse until she was ready to make them. And in a few weeks, they would come and pick up their clothing. She was very selective in the way she placed clothing in the quilt. For instance, I'm going to use my quilt. And in my book, I mentioned my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, who passed away or who was killed by the ex-slave owner. And if you look to the extreme right, right, the second block, three, let me see, one, two, the third block down on the right, that very first block is you'll find a picture of Ella's bloodied wedding dress. I won't go into detail of how that happened because that's in the book and it would take up too much time. But she placed that. It was the placement of her of the clothing in the quilt is the thing that told the story. And as she would tell me these stories, she also told me the story of the people who are inside on both sides of that white wedding dress that you'll see there, one piece to the left, one piece to the right. Those people have story, and the stories are so profound, so compelling. Even as a young 6, 7, 8-year-old girl, they were captivating to me. And over the years, I learned the stories of all these people that grandmama placed in her quilt. And it was amazing how she used to describe it, and her storytelling acumen was just unbelievable for a person who never went to school, had no formal education. But she was able to articulate the lives of these people just like she had a master's degree. And as I got older and start seeing these things through adult eyes, it used to amaze me how this woman was able to capture all these stories and describe them in detail, what happened to these people, their lives, how the way they lived, how the way they died. And that was the most amazing part of her. That was the most amazing piece with this quilt here. I still have my Quilt of Souls, and it's a centerpiece of my life because sometimes I just take it and I just hold it, and it bring back memories of my grandmother. Next slide. Now this is, and as we go along, I want you to keep that image, let it marinate in your mind of that Quilt of Souls, because this is the next quilt that I want you to please just marinate, because I'm gonna refer back to it of something to see, do you see the same thing that I see? This is grandmama's last quilt. I was in my 30s when I watched her add the last piece or the final pieces to this quilt. By this time, she mostly communicated through songs. Her ability to articulate stories was somewhat diminished by then, but don't get it wrong, she was still very, very sharp. Um, but I just keep an image of that quilt in your mind, because my grandmother quilted this quilt. She was 101. And that is very amazing. Just like the next slide that I'm gonna show you. Next slide, please. This is a newspaper article that was written on my grandmother at the age, she had just turned 100. And as you can see, she could still thread a needle. And that is the absolute truth. I would watch her. At a 100, she could thread a needle better, quicker and faster than I could. And she was an amazing woman because she quilted almost all the way up to the point of 103, 104, where she just couldn't hold a needle anymore. Next slide. Okay, here is the quilt. As I told you, and I'll refer back to my earlier slide, when I stated that my grandmother's 4 siblings were sold in slavery. Um, they were sold when they were infants. My grandmother was a later life child, both her and Ella. But of course, like I said, Ella was born in 1877, but she died. She was killed at the age of 19. This is, I've always wanted to connect genealogy, ancestry, quilting together, because to me, they are intimately connected. And this quilt is a representation of that. If you look at the quilt, I had when DNA testing came out, I've always, and listening to my grandmother talk and that longingness to find in her um, siblings, because she never stated it outright, but I can see it in her eyes that this is a longing that she had. That because if you just imagine yourself coming up in this world with no siblings, no aunts, no uncles, no grandparents. The only thing my grandmother, the only lineage that she possessed was her children and grandchildren, because all the other ones were either sold in slavery, they were separated somewhere between the Carolinas and Alabama and Mississippi. So my grandmother really didn't have anyone. So my goal back in the 2000s when DNA testing came out, I wanted to learn as much as I could about genealogy because I wanted to somehow find my grandmother's siblings, lost lineage. And that happened because I was able to get my mother's and my father's DNA. And through getting their DNA and having it processed, I was able to extract that paternal from that maternal side. So even going further, once I got into ancestry and started looking at all these ancestors as after I had abstracted my parents, two parents' DNA, I was able to find two of my grandmother's siblings, ancestry, lineage. And I connected with my grandmother's siblings um, ancestors. And when we connected, it was really, really powerful because they in turn was trying to do the same thing. They had heard the same story, how their great and great grandmothers or grandparents were separated, were sold in slavery, and they was always trying to find that lost lineage. And here was my grandmother who was that connection. So we talked and we cried. And from there, I wanted to find a way to connect them some kind of way, even though my grandmother had passed and so had their great grandparents had passed. So I became really good friends with some people from the Quilters of Color Network in New York City. I asked them what would be a good way I told them my story. I let them decide what they wanted to do with that. They said, okay, if you can get clothing from those ancestors, which was on the maternal side, either whether they were living or they passed away, you can send those to me and we will make this quilt is what I call the quilt that binds. So what I did was I collected fabric, clothing from those ancestors. And if you look at the blue border around my grandmother's picture there, and you'll see, I don't have a pointer, but you will see that same pattern, that same material scattered throughout the quilt. That is my grandmother's last robe that she had on when she passed. Actually, she had on this robe when she passed. So this was the connection. So what they did was they took her robe and they connected pieces with her ancestors. So they are together, and I have the quilt and I hang this quilt up so I can always look at it because we're not looking at this quilt anymore as a physical object, but what it represents symbolically. And that's what quilts do, you know. And since I wrote Quilt of Souls, a lot of people have been writing me how that they have been taking ties from their husband and from their grandparents and making quilts. I've just been overwhelmed with the amount of beautiful things I've been getting from people because of I was able to do this Quilt of Souls and the quilt that binds. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to move on but we're still going to come back to that quilt that binds, because if you look at it, you can see something in there that matter of fact, I'm going to go back to that again. Could you go back one slide, Kedra, please? If you look at this slide, now the people who did this quilt, they had no idea that about my grandmother's last quilt. because I had left it at my cousin's house in Alabama. So the quilt was never displayed on social media or anywhere else. And if you look at this is not traditional. My grandmother's last quilt is not Lula Horn's traditional trademark quilting styles. Her quilting styles are usually very large blocks, as you saw in the Quilt of Souls. She never quilted in lines like that, in diagonal lines, until she made her last quilt. So I just thought it was almost serendipitous to look at the quilt that they made with no idea how my grandmother's last quilt was. And they made it in the same type of pattern that she made her last quilt, her only quilt that she's ever quilted in that diagonal pattern, like her last quilt that I showed you a few moments ago. I just wanted to mention that. Next slide, Keidra. This is my great aunt. Her name is Annie Grace Horn Dotson, but I call her Aunt Tutney. She was also a master quilter. And if on that previous slide where I showed the road, that the desolate road, that was the road that I would take to her house. My job, according to my grandmother, was to take Aunt Tutney jams, jellies, peanuts, and sit and watch her quilt. I was the person who listened to her because I think Aunt Tutney was back in her 90s, but she still quilted. So my job was to go down that long, dusty, narrow road and sit with Aunt Tutney in her old house. Now, you can imagine a 10-year-old little girl. I don't have a picture, but I'm going to paint you a picture of how this house looked. Creaky steps, long dog trot. And a dog trot is the front of the house that you can look from the front to the back. A lot of people may call it, related to a shotgun house, but not quite like that. She had a large room with herbs growing everywhere, large stone fireplace, a stone floor, and she had two beds, two feather beds. One was packed with quilts, every kind of quilt that you can name. It was so high, it made the bed look like it set high off the ground. But my job was to sit in this huge rocking chair and listen to Aunt Tidney sew and sing. That was her thing. She was the opposite of grandmother. Aunt Tidney didn't talk much. She just barked out orders from the time I got there. Gal, get that needle. Gal, get that thread. Gal, crawl up under the bed and get this. Gal, go get me a bucket of water. So, and only thing I wanted to do was just couldn't wait until I could sit back in that large rocking chair, homemade rocking chair, and listen to Aunt Tudney sing and sew. That's because her sewing and her singing was so captivating because they were almost meshed together. So just like grandmama's stories was synonymous with storytelling, Aunt Tudney's stories, the ones she didn't tell, she sung, were synonymous to her singing. And Aunt Tudney was a woman who had heard a lot. You know, her husband was lynched, and her young son Josh disappeared, and we think that he was also lynched at the age of 10. Years ago for Aunt Tidney. I think this happened maybe when she was in her 40s. So Aunt Tidney had a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. So in her voice that you're going to hear, you're going to be able to hear the suffering. And quilting was just like my grandmother's and the other women was very cathartic, just like the singing. Oh, so you could play that slide. Next slide.
Hey, Rufus, hey, boy, where in the world you been so long? Hey, buddy, hey, boy. Well, I've been in the jungle, ain't going there no more. Well, I've been in the jungle, ain't going there no more. Hey, Rufus, hey, boy.
And to my surprise, I didn't find out Aunt Tutney was in the Smithsonian. She was recorded by Harold Corlander back in the 1930s. So when I heard that song through YouTube, I mistakenly discovered while I was doing some research, of course I had to boo-hoo because these were the same songs that I would hear coming up, sitting in there in the big rocking chair. And also, this song here is the song. Sometimes I would bring Aunt Tudney down the road. It was about a mile, so it would took us about 3 hours because she would stop and oh Lord, oh. So it was about a 3 hour walk. But the next song is so amazing because I remember her coming with my grandmother and other women sitting in the front yard sewing, and Aunt Tudney would sing this over and over again, and the women would just be so entranced in her music and the sewing and the hand sewing because nobody sewed by sewing machine. So it was very compelling as I laid up under the house because I couldn't hang around grown folks. So I would have to lay under the house and listen to them talk because this is when they did all their slave talk and talk about what's going on in the country. So can you play that, Keidra?
Wonder where is my brother gone? Wonder where my brother John? He is gone to the wilderness and coming no more. Wonder where will I lie down? Wonder where will I lie down? In some lonesome place, Lord, down on the ground. Wonder where will I lie down? In some lonesome place, Lord, down on the ground.
And that was Aunt Tudney's. That's the last time I heard, that's the last song I've ever heard her play. And it was just so amazing how it just happened to be on YouTube because that was her, I call that her quilting song. Next slide, Keidra. This is my quilt from Aunt Tutney, AKA Annie Grace Horn Downson. And I called it the 100 Tears quilt. And the reason I call it this because sometimes Aunt Tutney be in song and quilting, and you never knew whether it was sweat. She would just say, I'm just sweating, child. But it was tears, tears that never really dropped. They just stayed on her face. And but she always denied the tears. And that's why I call it the 100 Tears quilt. Next slide. And this is my Aunt Tudney's sister, Aunt Money, who lived in the same house, and they were always bickering and fighting each other. I've never seen two old women in their 90s that bickered as much as they did. They were sisters, but they were so cantankerous. But Aunt Money, I would sit in the swing, and she would have her quilt, and I would hold it, and she would quilt. But Aunt Money never said a word, never spoke a word. But I just wanted to throw her in there because she was a part of my quilting surroundings. Next slide. This picture, I found it in the Alabama archives because it is so indicative of how I remember women sitting when I would go into town, I would see women sitting, and I think this picture was in Sumter County, how women would sit on their porch quilting, humming some of the same kind of songs Aunt Tudney sung. And it was just so reminiscent of my life growing up in the country. and the women of my grandmother's era. Next slide. This woman here, this is Nancy Petway Young. Now, I am related, distant cousins to the Petways of Gee's Bend. I don't know how, haven't found out yet. But when I saw this, I thought about the quilting horse that my grandfather used to, I mean, he used to take 2 hours. My grandfather was slow, but he actually used to take about 2 hours to construct this quilting horse. I tried doing it once and it was just such a pain. I said I would never do it again because you got ropes going here, you got ropes going there. And the quilting horse is a difficult piece of material construction. So that's why I'm glad Grandma usually used her lap. And until all the women used to sit around and quilt. Then she would have my grandfather. He would complain every step of the way, but he would construct the quilting horse. And something else I want to throw in while we got the texture of the quilt. I was the person who was responsible for going out in the cotton field, picking bags of cotton. My grandmother and these women only put real cotton in their quilt for batting. My job, I had the nastiest job ever because number one, when me and my husband were driving along the highway and I see cotton fields, I just want to get out and burn them up. I hated picking cotton because a lot of times you had to stay, if anybody online now is from the South, they know how June, July, and August heat is. Sometimes you would have to pick 3 bags of cotton just for one, I would say, queen size quilt. So, and not only that, you think that's bad, the way you have to prepare the cotton for the batting. First of all, you have to go in there and pick out all the hard material in there. Then you have to make sure no boll weevils are in the cotton. Then you have to pick out the seeds. Then sometimes a few bulbs may be turning brown, and my grandmother's not going to take brown cotton or cotton that's been discolored in any way. And if that's not bad enough, it's laying out the cotton. My grandmother used to lay it out. I used to help her lay out the cotton, all the bulbs. You just pat it together and then you lay it out. She would use a rake-like implement to rake out the cotton large enough for the quilt that she was going to make. Then my little self, I would have to get on the cotton and roll and smash it. I was the roller. I was a human roller. And by the time I got up, I would have white cotton stuff in my hair, on my clothes. And so that it was a nasty job. But that was my job. I was the cotton roller. But picking it and rolling it was just not fun. But this was the only material they would use in their quilts, in their batting was this. And so when I saw this, I said, oh my God, I can see her laying out the batting on this quilt. And the quilting horse is attached, and now they're sitting around sewing it because that's the way my grandmother and her friends used to do. And the more, if a person would wanted a super thick quilt, then that's more cotton I would have to pick. So I just wanted to add that piece in there. Next slide. I'm going to take you about 60 miles down the road to Gee's Bend. And this is my favorite picture here. This is with Mary Ann Petway of the Gee's Bend, the historical Gee's Bend quilters. That is their little shed where they keep all their quilts. This was very enjoyable because they tried to take my Quilt of Souls, but I just wasn't giving that up. So, but this picture is with me at Gee's Bend, on the Gee's Bend property, which is actually 60 miles from where I grew up in Livingston. Next slide. And this, of course, this quilt is inside. She showed me this quilt, and it was so reminiscent of my grandmother's, the type of quilts my grandmother quilted. But this is inside the show place inside Gee's Bend where they have many of their quilts. So I love going there. I've been there several times, and I just enjoy going because it is in the country. If you're looking for something that's magnificent and high tech, you're not going to find it at Gee's Bend. Next slide. And this is when I walked in this room, I just got overwhelmed because it was just like I was in a candy store. it was so many pieces of material, and it just reminded me of my grandmother's smokehouse with all the clothing that she had received from people where she had it, and so she wouldn't mix up the clothing that belonged to someone else. So when I walked in there at G's Bend and saw this, how they store the quilts that they've completed or in the process of completing, it just brought back. It was just reminiscence of growing up with my grandmother in her little area where she used to keep her clothing for her quilts. Next slide. Okay, this is little Phyllis. This is me. I was 10 years old, and this is one of my favorite pictures because it's in my grandmother's front room. And a lot of people online, you may not ever heard of a whatnot shelf, but my grandmother lived for whatnot shelves. A lot of you, like I said, a lot of you probably don't know what that is, but it was a place where somebody give you something, you put it on the whatnot shelf. Any little doodad or anything else, you put it on the whatnot. And I was in love with the whatnot shelf because we didn't have any electricity, no running water, no indoor plumbing. So the whatnot shelf was pretty much my toy. And so I love this picture. And this picture has went a long way. So I'm going to show you how. The next slide, please. Sylvia Hernandez of the Quilt of Colors of New York, and you can look Sylvia up and you can look up Thaddean Wormleaf. They both are very popular in the New York quilting circle. But she liked the picture so much that she made a quilt, a Phyllis quilt. And I bring this in because I want to see how quilts have evolved from my grandmother's quilts, her Quilt of Souls, and the other women who have made quilts, because we made quilts. My grandparents made quilts, and people of my grandmother's era made quilts to keep us warm at night. It wasn't anything pretty about them, but they were beautiful. But that's the only thing quilts were used for. They wasn't used to display. They wasn't used to show off. They was used for basically three things: to keep warm at night, and to pass down to future generations. The quilts very seldom wore out because they were built so sturdy. And that's why I've slept many times. I've slept up under my quilt and it's still in they're still in mint condition. But this quilt here, I just want to show how it evolved when she made this quilt to show you that quilts are still being used. They're more toward the line of textile art. That's how I've always said, and a lot of people won't agree, that textile art was birthed from the heirloom quilts, like the ones my grandmother made. And so Sylvia and Thaddean and other women in Quilts of Color, they make a lot of textile art quilts that, you know, that looks at social injustice, just a lot of things. But I love these quilts because I just like looking at the way they've evolved from my grandmother's day to where we at now in the arena of textile art. Next slide. So as we coming up, speaking of textile art and quilting and textile art, I know I said this for a reason. I wanted to find a way to see how we can bring those two types of art together under one umbrella. Um, so I said, I want to come up with a quilting heirlooms and textile art workshop so people can look at quilt documentation to see the importance of quilt documentation because I feel that quilt documentation is so necessary. Not only quilt documentation, but oral history is so necessary. And the way we pass down, I've been in a situation where I saw a man in a garage on this beautiful quilt. I was just walking along in my neighborhood, and you could tell the quilt was old, and he was changing his oil on the quilt. And I just had to stop and query him about this quilt. And come to find out, it was his grandmother's quilt, who was born in the 1860s. He didn't know anything about the quilt. Only thing it had been used for changing oil. So somehow we have to get back to listening to those stories and find out, because I believe that each quilt, each old quilt has so much value. And like I said from the beginning, they're very sacred. And that's why I wanted to bring people together to have a conversation about the history of quilts and how stories are embedded in this quilt that we've never discussed for whatever reason. But it's the way to bring these things together and do workshops on quilt documentation, on textile, on the importance of quilting, and especially the heirlooms and how they now related to textile art, modern quilting, I guess some people would call it. But on September 27th and 28th, we will be having a workshop for the quilt for these quilters that I'm bringing in so they can do just that. And in addition to that, these quilters will also be displaying their exhibits, their textile art, their quilt on display at the Maryland History, I mean I'm in Maryland, at the Florida History Museum. So I encourage you to, if you're in the area, if you're in Florida somewhere, to please come by it, because it's going to be a very, very, very big event and a way for people to zoom in on what's going on in the quilting, heirloom, and textile world. So
Thank
in
you.
saying, oh, okay, go.
Oh, no, sorry, I didn't want to cut you off, but
Oh,
you were
no, no,
telling
no,
me
no. I'm,
again.
yeah, that's basically my story, and I'm not going to change it. This is my story.
No, absolutely not. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the share now. But again, that exhibition will be up from roughly June 13th to September 15th, and it'll also coincide with an exhibition that the Orange County Regional History Center is doing called By Heart and by Hand, which will be specifically about Black craft in Central Florida. So, and it will include a number of quilt artists. So they will have events lined up from summer all the way through the fall. But thank you so much, Miss Phyllis, and I'd love to get started with our Q&A if that's
Oh, okay. Oh,
where.
could I say one other thing in closing? Just to give you, and this is something that's have stuck with me for years. When I was about 9 or 10, my grandmother took me to this old slave cemetery that was right across the road, the dirt road from where we lived. We went down the hill, went up the hill, but it was an old slave cemetery, and it was something that she needed for me to hear to carry with me. But she said in her own Southern dialect, she said, "Child, you see these people laying here? These are the best stories you ain't never heard." And that stuck with me. And I think we need to carry that with us when we think about quilting and quilting documentation. Thank you for listening. And I hope I've said something that will resonate and you'll be able to carry with you.
I can't say amen enough. We
Yeah.
met strangely, it feels like it was yesterday, but last year, and the connection was so immediate, so
Yes, it
instant
was. Yes.
that, because I am also a child of the South in a very different generation. You are the same age as my parents, but I grew up with both my grandparents, who and my great grandfather who lived to 97 years old. So these
Mm.
stories were also very much foundational to my life as well. And so I kind of want to, in addition to the Q&A, I would love if folks could drop in the chat sort of, thinking about your ancestral home. For me, it's Orangeburg, South Carolina, because they picked cotton and that's where they were enslaved. But they had to come to Florida because of the boll weevil epidemic of the
Mhm.
1920s, which is what you mentioned. So I grew up
Yeah.
hearing about those stories of the land and what happened in this connection. And also Fort Gaines, Georgia, because my great grandfather fled there to escape a lynching. And so these tragedies, these histories of both that are both man-made and natural have a real impact on the stories that we tell, the lives that shape us. And
Yes.
I think that's why you and I had that connection so instantly, because the generations may change, but somehow the stories survive. And that's something I would love, if folks in the chat could sort of chime in with sort of where their ancestral home is. And also, if you are a quilter, because I am a curator, writer. I cannot pretend to quilt, but what I have is a love and appreciation, much like you do, Miss Phyllis. And so I'd
Yeah,
love to know for those of us who are attending, if you are a longtime quilter or fiber artist, who did you learn from? Whose stories are
yeah.
you now telling in the work that you do? I would love for you to name them in the chat because I think that's what's so powerful about the work that you're doing.
Hmm.
In that so much of textile history is a quote unquote anonymous, unknown history. We need to give these women, these ancestors, and also the men who did that work, their names, restore that history, even in just in small part, because I think that, the work that preservationists do is important, but we need to be willing to help them fill in those gaps as well as members of these communities. So I just want to thank you and thank the chat for your time. And I kind of wanted to start kind of by opening it up, um, by talking a little bit about your grandmother and her sisters. I loved that you included music and the songs that they sung in this presentation. And I cannot lie that some instinctive part of me just had to close my eyes and rock from side to side. It was a
Yes.
knee-jerk reaction. I did not listen to these before. Today was my first time listening to them.
Mhm.
And I just had to let my heart be filled because I
Right.
recognize the pain in those stories. And
Hmm.
and what's really powerful about it, and what I hope you could speak to us about it, is about recognizing that quilting was not a singular process of making, that through this song, through this, it's a merger, it's a transformation into something that is both multisensory and performance. So if
Hmm.
you could talk a little bit about sort of, is there something about, when you see these quilts in isolation versus hearing this, like, what was it like to put that puzzle back together, to now have the songs restored to that process, that product that you now recognize and carry with you?
And I forgot to mention that these are I forgot to always, my husband always, I always forget to mention my grandfather, which was my grandmother's husband was Edgar Horn, and these were his sisters, Aunt Tutney and Aunt Money. So, it was so amazing. And I'll go back to the first time I heard it on YouTube. I had to play it back maybe like 6 times because I said, this can't be, this can't be the song that I heard growing up. But going back as a little girl and you see things through a young person's eyes and seeing that through a young person's eyes, like I was 9, 10, I didn't leave until I was almost 13. But each time I sat with her and it have to do with maturation. I felt something different to a certain extent because, and I think that was all due to growth and maturation. But just putting those two things together, quilting and the singing, they were things. It was difficult to separate those two because almost like they blended into each other, they intersected each other, and you can feel the pain. You can actually feel the pain of this one in this woman's voice as she was doing it. And I was able to recognize that even more actually today than I did when I was a young when I was growing up there. Because listening to her, I mean, it's hard, like you said, it's hard not to sit there and rock and feel that pain that she's feeling. And and I think a lot of times this kept her from striking out, going doing something, you know, the hurt. And not only did it mask the hurt, but it also, you're in a bad situation when your husband have been lynched and there's nothing you can do about it. So that's why I say my grandmother's pain and Aunt Tudney's pain and I'm pretty sure a lot of other pain was masked through quilting. Quilting gave them that relief. Singing gave them that relief because my grandmother used to sing, and I think that was what got them through those difficult times in the 50s and 60s, that needle and that thread. That's why I say those things intersect so much. And so that's what I see when an answer to your question.
Yes, and there are a few questions in the chat about the singing.
Okay.
One, Tanya asked whether your auntie ever sung a hymn or a spiritual by James Weldon Johnson, whether they were other songs that she sung.
I'm glad she mentioned that because not only, and even you can look up these people. I grew up not only with my aunt singing, but also you can look up Doc Reed and Vera Bratt. They were Matter of fact, Vera Ward's music was taken by Moby, and he won a Grammy Award with it.
Yes, I know the song you're talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
Yes,
That was
yes,
my grandfather. That's Miss Vera used to come and sit in our front yard and sing. And I think the name of the song was Trouble So Hard.
yes.
Her and Doc Reed were, I mean, they used to sit in my grandparents' yard all the time and sing. And I'm related to Vera Hall too, so which I thought was amazing. But it's weird how they used to that, that's only one instance of somebody taking because there's nothing they can do because they're copyright through so they can't sue or anything like that. But listening to the songs coming up and how it was a lot of singers during that era who were recorded by Harold Corlander, like my grandmother. But and I didn't forget what your question was.
It was about it was about James Weldon
James Weldon
Johnson.
Johnson. No,
We
I
have lots
can't.
of questions in the chat, so that'll
I
be one
can't.
of several.
I can't remember specifically about James Weldon Johnson, but what I remember very well was Free at Last," what came way before the whole Selma thing and the slogan came, because those people were singing that back years ago. Matter of fact, my grandfather and her sister used to tell me, because my great grandfather Josh is one of the most interviewed people of the WPA slave narratives. And he talks about in his memoirs and his stories how they couldn't preach or they couldn't sing too many spirituals on that particular plantation. So they would take it to the wash tub. And I'm going,
Mm.
what's taking it to the wash tub? They would sing inside the wash tub so to try to muffle that they were singing about God and stuff. And I thought that was just very interesting. But not James Weldon Johnson, but there are other songs that have, like Free at Last, that was sung way before it was popular to do so.
And we had a question about the county that your grandmother lived in. I looked it up just quickly, and it looked like it was Sumter
Sumter
County,
County. Yeah, Sumter
Alabama.
County.
Okay,
Right.
great, great.
Yes, Sumter County.
And then one person in the chat wanted to know, could you clarify? Gail wanted to know if you could clarify if a quilting horse is the same as a quilting frame.
I think so because we called it a quilting horse because it looked like a horse because it was two pieces of wood
We
and
had
then
own vernacular for everything.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. I'm pretty sure it's the same thing, quilting frame. Yep. But it was we didn't have all I don't know how the quilting frames are constructed today, but we didn't have all the fancy smancy stuff. So my grandfather had to use ropes and whatever else he can get just to keep it steady enough. And it would take him about 2 hours it would be ropes literally coming from the side of the house down to one part of the horse. And so he tried to teach me how to do it, and I just couldn't do it. It was too complicated.
Yeah.
Too complicated.
I understand. I
Yeah,
understand. And then
yeah.
we had a great question again from Tanya that says, "How do you respond to the fixed traditional patterns now marketed with this idea of perfect points meeting? Do you think your grandmother would chuckle a bit and ask why you're doing it like that?"
Yeah, yes, she would. Because, and to go back to that, my grandmother, and I've seen her do this with every quilt. She didn't have rulers and tape measures. She used the length of her hand, both lengthwise and widthwise, and to determine the size of
Exactly.
her quilt, and she would cut from there. So
Exactly.
no, she wasn't. She
Yeah.
would never be big on points because if you look at my Quilt of Souls, it's crooked, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
because she used her eyes, but to become that straight, that was amazing for not being able to measure anything, with any of the more, of the rulers and stuff, which she would never use. So no, all that point stuff, this have to be, no, not at all. Far from it.
Far from it.
Far
Okay,
from
I'm
it.
going to try to rush through these last few
So,
questions because again, it was such an inspiring talk. I think there was so much for us to connect
yeah,
with, and so much that I personally think that we all need to sit with,
right.
just to absorb just how powerful these stories are. But one question is the backing on your grandmother's quilt. How was it developed and the materials? Was that you also picking the cotton for the backing of her quilts as well?
It was feed sack.
Feed sack. Okay.
Feed sack.
Okay. And then how did the rain influence the cotton process for batting making or filling the quilts?
Well,
Like,
actually, I've seen my grandmother's friends, and especially Aunt Tutney's brew down there. They would they would put the cotton, pick the cotton and put it in a big hot pot. I mean, boil the cotton first.
Mhm.
My grandmother didn't like boiled, so water was not a way of affecting the cotton in either way because they boiled the cotton because they thought it was easier to pick out all the stuff that didn't need to be in there, and plus it was an easier way to mesh it together. I didn't particularly like doing it like that. I'd rather get in the cotton. The only problem you have with cotton, as in its present state without putting any water on it, because what sometimes when you roll in it, you may roll over into a boll weevil or the cotton shucks that's attached to it. But it
Mhm.
also helped you identify where it was. So no, the water didn't never affected the cotton. No, it was just when you're picking it, it's harder to pull out because cotton sticks to the shuck.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. What size needles were used by your elders? I guess this is an
Oh,
important point to
oh,
make since your grandmother was still threading them at 100.
oh my God. She used, if I'm thinking back on that, she used different size, but all the needles I've seen her big, they were pretty large needles. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't recognize the size, but they were pretty large. She never used those little tiny needles that you see today. So they were pretty, and she would put it in her apron. So she would have like 4 or 5 big needles. So all the needles that she used were large. Every woman down south had an apron. My
Yes.
my 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 great aunt had one for every day of the week. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think that is what is so incredible about grandmother Lula's story in particular is that, we think of 100 years as a long time, but 100 years for a country that's celebrating 250, like
Right. Yeah.
recognizing that this woman was born in Reconstruction era South and
Yes.
lived through the Reagan era, like
Right.
all of the things that happened in the course of her
Oh,
life
right.
and I love what you talked about when you were talking about knowledge, because I think that in a lot of respects, in a lot of Black communities, there
Yeah.
became such a focus on formalized education that a
Right.
lot of us weren't taught those same skills because the thought was, no, we want you to be more than us. We want you
Right.
to go and, go to school and do all these things that we weren't forced to do.
Right.
And so one of the things that I'd love to also talk about is sort of, are there new ways of storytelling that you are now seeing generationally? I know for me, it's hair. My mother constantly braided my hair. And now I find that as I'm doing the same thing for my daughter, I'm
Mhm.
telling her stories, I'm talking to her about life, I'm asking about her. Are there other ways that you're seeing these traditions pass on,
Yeah.
quilting or otherwise, that are inspiring you in this moment?
And see, I think that's what's missing in our society today, Kedra, because when I was growing up, those stories were just, I mean, my ears would pop right open. I mean, I love to hearing the story.
Because
Because
you were in grown folks' business.
right, yeah, and grown folks' business. And plus, there was no television, there was no video games, there was no digital stuff. So it was, you had to listen because you find out the best stuff through those stories. But somehow, and I'm going to blame it on technology, that oral storytelling kind of like fell to the back. Oh, that's not interesting. I don't want to know about that old stuff. That's the old, oh, they did that in the old days. And I used to always, even, among my kids who are in their 40s now, they love listening to it because I'd hate to use force it on them, but I used to talk to them about it so much. Now my granddaughters, they love those type. I mean, they're old, so just like I was, for some reason, they're
Old
old
folks.
souls.
Yeah.
But the hair braiding thing is just so, that's just so potent because,
Exhibition idea loading. We'll
yeah,
talk.
yeah.
You're already my local mom, so
Oh, yeah,
we'll
that's
talk.
right. That's right.
But
Yeah, yeah,
but I just wanted to give our audience some food for thought with that because we are
yeah,
now one past the hour, so I want to respect everyone's time.
yeah,
However, I
yeah,
do want to thank you, and I say Miss Phyllis because again, like I said, I'm from the South. I try to
yeah,
remember
yeah.
Phyllis when I'm in mixed company, but for me, it's Miss Phyllis.
Miss Phyllis, yeah, yeah.
I am so grateful for what you should, like you said, there are knowledges that aren't recognized by
Yes,
many as knowledge.
right.
And being able to grow up where you're negotiating both those worlds, I think is an important skill set that still needs to continue because
Yes.
as art historians and curators like myself bring
Yeah.
these conversations into the classroom, we bring an awareness, certainly with our students, about the fact that this transmission of knowledge isn't always tied to a book or literature, that song, making, quilts, they're all part of this very important dialogue that we still need to be having as a
Yes.
society. And so we did have one question specifically about documenting the quilts, but hopefully we can save I assume that SDA will save all of the chat because this is asking about Adonna Richardson, who I assume is doing quilt preservation work in California.
Yes.
So we'll send you a note about that, and we'll keep everything on file because I personally would like to look back at the chat to see where everyone tuned in to us from today. But
Yes.
in any case, I want to thank you, thank SDA, thank our sponsors, and thank you all for attending today. This again was such a powerful conversation, and we're really grateful to have had it. I also want to encourage everyone to tune in to the next Textile Talk scheduled for next Wednesday. It's entitled Fandom in the Quilt World, a New Architecture of Participation, and it's sponsored by the International Quilt Museum. If you enjoy Textile Talks, please consider supporting this event through your donation. So once again, I want to thank you, thank Lucy, thank Astrid and SDA for this wonderful opportunity. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.